A marking gauge is so engaging. Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. I had a few questions recently from a couple different people about marking gauges. How do you use them? How do you sharpen them? How do you maintain them? What are the different types? What should I be looking for in a marking gauge? And I kind of want to go over some of these ideas. I haven't done this in the past. I thought it was kind of a basic question, but at one point I had all these questions myself. I just had to find a way to answer them. So let's dive in and take a look at different types of gauges and how to use them. So first of all, what is a marking gauge? This particular one is a Stanley number 61, and it is a very basic. You're probably going to find these in a lot of your antique stores and whatnot. Some of them will come with a plastic thumb screw here. This one has a wooden thumb screw, and I just like how they come together. It's such a simple system, and really all a marking gauge is a fence and a way to make a line. And in most cases, at least in the traditional ones, you're just going to have a scratching point. And so some people will file this into a square point. I like to keep mine fairly round. And all it is a point that will then scratch the wood, a specific distance in from the fence. So let's actually take a look at a couple different types. You have the standard marking gauge that I showed you before. All it is a point and a fence. And then you can get over here into some of the more fancier mortising gauges, and these actually have 2 points and a fence. So you can have 2 lines running parallel to whatever surface you're checking. And then you can get into some of the bigger ones. These are more of a panel gauge, and so you have your point way out here, but the fence can be a long distance away from the point. And then you have some that have knives and some that have wheels, and they're a bunch of different types. The Japanese style tend to have like a marking gauge knife instead of a pin. There are a lot of other different styles that you can get, but most of the time I'm just going to be using these sharp points. Some people like to file into a square. I just like to keep them round. Anytime I need to sharpen them, I'm just going to take the file and slowly go around it until I get to a point that is nice and sharp and feels good, something that just kind of catches a little bit on the skin. That's all I need to do, and I really only do that like once a year or so. They maintain their sharpness relatively well. I'll leave a link to the gauges that I use. This particular one is from Harbor Freight. It's like $9, dirt cheap, but it's one that I use almost daily. Particularly, it has a point here on the back that you can use just like a regular marking gauge, or you can flip it over and you can have your mortising gauge. And I'll show you in a minute how I set that up. And then this one is from Veritas. I really like it because it has these lockdown screws, and you can set one to one length, and so basically it's a mortising gauge. So you have one knife that's running a certain distance away and another knife that's running a certain distance away, and you can make your line on there. Now these actually have a wheel on the end, and this one has a chip on it. I need to replace it. And some people like to make these wheels turn, but if you loosen them up so much that they turn, then they tend to have a bit of a wobble in them, and your line might not be as accurate. You're supposed to keep them tight and just rotate it to use different portions of the blade, or slowly rotate it as you wear out one section or another. They're relatively cheap to replace, and I just need to switch this one out. You take an Allen wrench, the screw comes out, put in the new piece, put the Allen wrench screw back in, and you're good to go. For the larger panel gauges, they tend to have a very long fence, and this is one that I actually made myself. I have a video on it a while ago. The long fence makes it so it's not going to bounce around on you as much. Whereas if I have one of these out here and I'll be making a mark in at say 6 inches, which is rather ridiculous for us, it's very easy to turn it slightly. And anytime you turn it, you're getting a different distance away from the edge. With a large fence on here, I can keep it very easily up against the side, and I don't have problems turning it. So a large fence means that you can have a longer reach out. So now let's actually talk about setting the marking gauge. Now what a lot of people do is they'll get your tape measure or whatnot, and they'll move the fence over and they'll say 1/2 inch away from there, and then they'll lock it down. The problem with that is that you really need a third hand to do this, to lock everything in place and make sure that it stays there, and then come around and turn it back and see I've moved off the line a little bit. What I generally want to do is mark my line on the wood, and so if I want it at 1 inch, I'm going to come in here, set that right on the edge, and make my mark at 1 inch. Then I'm going to come in, I'm going to loosen up this fence. I'm going to put that pin in the knot in the hole that I just created, and then slide the fence up against it. And that way I can use 2 hands very easily to get that same mark, and then slide it on the wood. Now you'll notice here I'm gripping it halfway between the pin and the fence. What that does is it keeps it from wanting to twist around on you. It's not as important up here when we're working like 1 inch away and making a line on that. But if I were to shift this out to say 4 inches, if I try and grab it back here, there's going to be this friction back here and it's wanting to make it bounce and my line's not very straight. Whereas with this, I can grab it halfway down here and I can make a really nice clean line here that I can then follow. And you can see the difference between letting it bounce around and a nice clean line. So you're always wanting to grip it on the shaft about halfway between the fence and the pin. That'll give you the best control over it. I've had a lot of people ask me why I don't use this wheel gauge as much as I use just the simple pin. And one of the problems is with the wheel gauge, it tends to have a problem of following the grain. And so if I'm running with the grain like this, it won't be as much a problem with this because it's much softer like cedar. But what will happen is as I run it around, if the grain runs off this way, then the wheel will want to follow that grain, and then suddenly I'm out here away from my fence. And so sometimes with the knives or with the wheels, they'll want to follow the grain and they can be hard to control when running with the grain. Going cross grain, not a problem at all. You get a nice clean line right there. That's where one of the people, sometimes people don't like the pins as much because they tend to kind of tear up the wood a bit. And so you cross grain here, you get a lot of this chip out. If that's a problem for your work, then using a knife or a wheel gauge is best on the cross grain, and then running with the grain, it's better to use a pin than it is to use a knife or a wheel gauge. So if you're working with just one pin, it's easy to set up your mark, slide your fence to it, and lock it down. But what happens if you're working with 2 pins? Well, you'll notice on this particular one, this has a slide underneath that will go back and forth. Often I will be using it to match it up to the width of my chisel. And what I'll do is I'll use my thumb on this side, and I'll slide it up until I get it close to the marks for the chisel. Right there. And then I will hold that in place with my thumb, and my thumb will lock that down. And then I can bring it over to the board, and I can then set it in my lines, and just like before, lock that in. The problem with this then is the pin is underneath, and it becomes kind of a confusing mess to do that. So if you're setting it up to match a chisel, and you don't know what the distance of the fence is, you might want to try that, but it's going to take some hands to figure it out. What I'll often do is I'll come over to the board, and I'll set my chisel where I want it to be, and I'll mark on this side of the chisel, and then I'll mark on this side of the chisel, and then I'm going to come in with the pins, and I'll set one pin into the first hole, and I'll slide the other pin over to the second hole. I'll hold that in place, and then I can slide the fence over and lock it down. And now I have 2 pins that are both the same width as the chisel and the same distance away from the fence, so that I can make my lines. And particularly in the cedar being so soft, they kind of mess it up. But you can see how they'll come across like that. So for a mortising gauge, whether it be with wheels or whether it be with pins, usually what I want to do is I want to make the marks on the wood and then set these into the lines. So if I want, let's see if we can double up these. And so I'm going to set this one into this line, and I'm going to slide this one over and set it into this line, and then I can lock both of these down. And now I have the exact same settings on this mortising gauge as I do on this mortising gauge. So I can take those lines and bring them over here. And I'll do one line there, and I'll do one line there. And that's one of the things you may notice that I'll often do is when making a mortising gauge with a wheel, rather than trying to make both in contact with it the whole time, I'll lift one up and I'll just mark one line, and then I'll put it down and I'll just mark the other line. Makes it a little bit easier and simpler rather than trying to think about both lines being on there at the same time. With the pin style, you don't have to worry about it as much because having both pins on there is easy. They're right next to each other, and so you can make the exact same line. So I hope this has answered a few questions about mortising gauges and how to use them and how to maintain them. It's really not that complicated, and there's a lot of little tips and tricks about how your hand holds it and how you feel it and the way you grab it that you'll just slowly learn over time. If something doesn't feel right or it's hard to maneuver, then you may want to change your grip up. Try and hold it in a different place. Try and move your force one way or the other so that you're not putting so much leverage on one side that moves all around. It's not that difficult of a task, but sometimes it can be very confusing. I do want to say thank you to the Wood by Wright Hive Mind on Facebook. It was because someone on there submitted the idea for this. So if you want to find out more about that, you can look up on Facebook Wood by Wright Hive Mind and ask to join. And that's where I get a lot of ideas and bounce some of the suggestions off of people. And a lot of the video ideas actually come from there. Someone saying, how do you do this? I'll be like, oh, I haven't thought about that again. Maybe I should make a video on it. So thank you for that. Also, I want to say thank you to the folks on Patreon. You guys are the reason why I can keep putting out videos like this. Patreon is really a very important part of Wood by Wright and the reason why I can keep putting out these videos. So thank you for that. If you'd like to find out more about that, you can do so right down there. Also, if you can subscribe, like, and share, those are all extremely helpful for the channel. Or my second channel, you can see some behind the scenes footage up there. That's about it for today. Until next time, have a wonderful day.